Washington has strongly backed the Libyan opposition since a revolutionary wave engulfed the state. It's now equally enthusiastic in its support against Syria's President Bashar al-Assad. But the concern is whether America's decision to take sides could backfire on its closest Middle East ally, Israel. RT's Ganesh Chikan looks at the possible repercussions of U.S. policy.
As nations in the Middle East and North Africa are torn between the struggle to bring about change and the struggle not to let that change ruin their lives, Washington views the Arab Spring as an opportunity to finally see some of its longtime foes crumble.
Even though Iran is not an Arab country, the Arab Spring could spread to...
Absolutely. And I think in many ways it's a matter of time before that kind of change and reform and revolution occurs in Iran as well.
Under the umbrella of Arab revolutions, Washington is also beating the drums of regime change in Syria, Iran's closest ally in the region. Violence within the country has been widely condemned. Countries like Russia and China call for both sides in Syria to talk and end the bloodshed, while America is blaming Assad alone.
The transition to democracy in Syria has begun, and it's time for Assad to get out of the way.
I think Assad's days, just like Gaddafi, are numbered.
Let's hope that Bashar Assad is next in line.
They've overthrown Gaddafi. They're going to have a proxy or client government in Tripoli. The next step is Syria. They want to overthrow Syria next, to take advantage of any movement that exists in Syria to overthrow the Assad government. Not they have a more democratic government, a more humane government, but a government that is allied with the United States. And after Syria, the next target will be Iran itself.
Watching regimes go down one by one, American politicians are filled with new hopes and aspirations. Some went as far as to predict the Arab Spring would spread all across the world.
What this is all about is the Arab Spring, and Bashar Assad is next. And even places like China and Russia and other places, they are very uneasy. This is about people aspiring for freedom, and that's what the Libyan people have just achieved.
It's wishful thinking on the part of John McCain, but it speaks volumes to where the real orientation is in Washington, not just of the Republicans, but the Democrats, too. I believe that the United States government feels, in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union 20 years ago, this year, that there's one single power left in the world. So they would like to overthrow the government in China. They would like to overthrow the government in Russia. They would like to overthrow the government in Venezuela, in Cuba, or wherever people are independent of the dictates of Washington, but I think it's a fantasy.
But when it comes to Syria and Iran, Washington doesn't seem to be just fantasizing about revolutions. It actively fosters the process by pledging support for anti-government movements there. But some say this might eventually turn against America's closest ally in the region, Israel.
If you were to see the rise of a popular revolution with very extreme Islamic fundamentalist elements there, what you have with Hamas could essentially spread to many more places, and then you'd have a much, much larger population base in an extremely hostile position towards the very existence of Israel.
By throwing its support behind revolution makers, analysts say Washington is seeking to increase its influence and control in these countries.
Let's look at how things have been in the control department so far. Egypt. Thousands protest against the U.S.-backed military there that's still in power. Last week, Egyptians stormed the Israeli embassy, enraged by the killing of 5 Egyptian border guards. In Libya, a Washington-supported leadership is taking over, but the country is at risk of plunging into tribal war. Syria, the opposition includes those with radical agendas. So the aftermath of the so-called Arab Spring remains very murky and difficult. Yet Washington seems to be using the Arab Spring to fulfill its longtime goals. But the fear is it might end up getting the opposite of what it wishes for and undermining the whole region. I'm Ganesh Shakyan reporting from Washington.